It's almost inevitable not to think about rainy scenery with watercolor, since watercolor is such a natural medium to interpret wetness. It is a subject that I wanted to paint when I started learning watercolor. While I do have a couple of rainy scenery painting videos on this channel, today I want to talk a bit more about the principles of painting a rainy street scenery. Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. So, whenever we're talking about a rainy street scenery painting, it's hard not to talk about the master, Joseph Zbukvich. To me, there's no question that's his signature subject. He came up with distinct visual languages to interpret rainy street scenery that looks both believable and with personality. While it's hard to deviate completely from his work, it is important to analyze the subject ourselves. Otherwise, we will be lost when we try to paint from our own reference. So here are three things to keep in mind when it comes to painting a rainy street scenery. Number one, connect shapes. Well, this is not only for rainy scenery, and you probably heard me talk about it a lot, but connecting shape is one of the most important things to establish the sense of atmosphere, because the environment is covered with rain and wet air, so we want to give that sense of misted atmosphere. If you try to separate shapes and make things clear, you lose that sense of atmosphere. Number two, push the depths with value. Most of the rainy weather is cloudy and overcast, which means that we don't get direct sunlight, so the lighting is more ambiguous and the colors are very muted. But that doesn't mean the subject lacks value. Instead, you should use different values to push and pull objects and create depths. Things that are further away are lighter because of the atmosphere, and things that are closer are darker. Number three, reflections. Shapes and atmosphere create the setting for your painting, and the reflection gives the context of your story. Without some reflections on the ground, the viewers will have a hard time to tell it is a wet surface, and it will end up just look like a foggy weather, which is fine if that's what you want. But if you want to give that sense of wetness, having some reflective wet surface is very important. You are likely going to see those in your reference anyways, so make sure you include those in your painting. Okay, let's take a look at the process of this painting that I painted. The reference is actually a screenshot of a video game, believe it or not. Before we start, if you like my video, consider giving it a like and subscribe. Ring the bell icon so you will get a notification whenever I put out a new video. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so let's start doing this painting. So the orientation I decided to go with is a very tall vertical ratio. And I gotta admit, this is learned from Joseph Zbukvich as well. This composition really shows how tall and the verticality of the cityscape. And since the reference screenshot has this dome architecture and is pretty tall, so I saw it's very suitable to use this type of composition. So start off with a pencil sketch. You do notice that I move things around just a little bit to fit this composition. This is a creative freedom that you can practice every time you're painting a scenery painting, because you want things to serve your painting, not the other way around. So while you do want to keep the things in the reference, what attracts you and what represents this location in your painting, but you also can move things around, you can also recompose it in a way that makes your painting work better. So I start out with a very dull 4B pencil. This is just a very typical drafting pencil with 4B lead. And I have never sharpened this pencil because I want to keep this pencil very light, very dull. So I'm barely touching the paper right now. So you can see it a little bit, but it's not very clear. And now I switch to a mechanical 4B pencil. The lead is much sharper, so I can draw a cleaner drawing after I'm set with the shape and everything else. So I start off with the big shape, and now I go into the detail just a little bit and get the shape and structure works a little bit better. So I decided to move the car and the figure up just a little bit so we have more room on the bottom to show the reflection. So I probably will do a quick lesson about how to draw and paint a card very soon. I remember doing a poll between doing a car or a furry animal like a cat, and most people choose cat, so I did that one first. But I will be doing a lesson on how to draw and paint card. So here are some figures. Make sure they are on the same eye level. And I add in another figure that's a lot bigger, which is a lot closer to us. But he's still sharing the same eye level. I loosely indicate where the reflection is going to be. But this is a very simple painting, just 2 cars, 3 figures, and the buildings on the back. I didn't really do much detail in the back building as well because it's really not necessary. Even in the reference, you can see that the fog in the background is really pushing the depths and it get rid of a lot of contrast and detail. While you can still see some details within that background buildings, if you squint your eyes, the shape all merge together into one single shape, and that is something we want to achieve in our painting. So erase some of the messier lines to make the line work cleaner. Now I do use a little bit of masking fluid for the area that's going to be highlight, such as the street light, the signal, and the tail light and the reflection of the tail light on the car. This will help me to avoid painting around the light, and I can focus on making big washes, and I also don't need to use gouache afterwards because gouache, while it can help, you do need to use quite a bit of it to get that light back. So I decided to just use masking fluid this time. Okay, so here comes the first wash. The first wash is very light and watery. We are just establishing the light and atmosphere for the first wash, so you can see a bead gather in the bottom. And we can use that to continue the wash down. So I also start from going a little bit cooler to a little bit warmer and back to cooler because the cool on the ground is reflecting the sky, which is a lot cooler. So while it is still moist, I decided to do some cloud. It's not in the screenshot, but I decided to do it anyways. It's very subtle though, it's not very dark. Just to have a little bit something interesting in the sky. Most important thing for the first wash is just to keep it clean and establish that sense of atmosphere and light. And it also helps tremendously when you get rid of the white of the paper, because after you do that, you start to feel a lot more comfortable painting stuff in because the paper is not perfectly white anymore. So the first wash is pretty much dry, so I start off with painting the background building. And as you can see, I try to remain it a single wash. Now I do use a little bit of damp brush to get a little bit of light on the top of the dome just to show a little bit of volume. But for the most part, I try to paint just a single shape. Now I am going to add a little bit detail later, but as you can see, that's not really important compared to getting a good shape. So now I'm using a darker mixture, a little bit more thicker mixture, and paint wet onto wet, get some of that detail in. And I continue to wash down. It's important to keep that shape going in a single wash. So here I just continue to mix a little bit more colors and continue the wash and try to finish that background building. So you do need to work with a certain amount of speed. You cannot take your good old time trying to paint every single little detail if you want to have this nice, clean, big wash of this whole building in the background. You can spray a little bit of water to keep it moist a little bit longer, But in general, just use a little bit bigger brush if you are painting a bigger area, just to make things a little bit easier. And make sure you have enough mixture when you do that. So the top is almost damp, so I added just a little bit more detail. I want those details to come out just a little bit more. So I do a little bit of wet onto wet. And we do have a little bit more detail on the top. And the bottom as well, I just add a little bit more detail wet onto wet. So you can kind of see a little bit of something within that shape, but it's still largely one single shape. So this wet onto wet technique is great for adding a little bit suggestive detail in the foggy area. So I continue the wash down again. I paint around the umbrella. I do want a clean cutout for that. And for the figure, for the most part, I'll just paint over. I used to always try to leave out highlight for the figure in the car, but that's not always necessary to me. So it's more important to get a nice clean big wash. So I did leave out a little bit of highlight on the side of the car and the white car in the distance and the reflection, just so that we can have that sense of value and lighting already. And I do want to start giving some sense of reflection already, so some wet onto wet. And I also use a damp brush to get rid of some paint as well, just to show a little bit of the light. So while it is still wet, see how I start to paint some reflections. And also give the tail light a little bit of red already, but after we get rid of the masking fluid, it will show some bright light, which is something that is going to work out very nicely. So painting some dark reflections while it is still wet. This is the fun part, that you get to play with wet on wet, and it will just naturally look like a wet floor, a wet street. A clean damp brush and get some directional lines and some textures just to break that reflection a little bit, so it doesn't look like mirror. Okay, so the background is pretty much dry, and I will be able to do another layer on top. But in terms of the background itself, there isn't that much more to paint. I just add a little bit more dark in the ground and a tiny little bit more detail just to kind of fill that gap between the background and the foreground. And this will also connect with the buildings on the right, which is closer to us, so it is going to be darker. So now I'm mixing a darker mixture and starting from the top and the building on the right. And as you can see, a little bit darker value that separates that building from the background. And this helps us to establish the depths of the scenery. So if you squint your eyes, you can see there's three values right now. The far background with the sky is almost the white of the paper, and the background building, which is like a light medium value, and a darker value, which is more in the foreground. So I start to paint out a little bit of the detail, get some tree out, but notice that is part of the foreground building shape. So I'm not trying to separate everything, trying to merge and connect the shape as much as possible. And now here is the figure that I invented in this painting. So kind of like our main character here. It's actually very simple, just focusing on painting the shape. And while we're at it, I started to paint the figures on the back as well. So this back figure on the umbrella, it is in the game screenshot, so I pretty much just used that one. And he has a pretty nice gesture actually, so I just trying to replicate that. And another figure walking sideways. So there we got three figures, and there's another small hidden figures on the back, just a very simple shape. And now we establish even more depths by adding the figures. So this really shows that you really don't need a lot of details. You just need some solid shape and use the proper value, and we establish the depths and makes the scenery believable. I'm starting to paint out the street light, the signal light, and some details and so on. Things that's starting to pop out. It's time to finish up the car. So the black car is definitely a lot darker. So we go over that first. We do leave out just a little bit of a light to break up so it doesn't look too heavy. And the background card that is mostly white. So I just add a little bit of the shadow underneath, a little bit of dark just to show some structure and form. And now I re-wet the bottom of the paper, the area of the reflection, and I come back in with a dark mixture to keep that nice and soft. So also careful where you are painting the reflection. You only want some dark reflection where it's needed. We already painted a first layer of reflection, if you can see. So now we're just painting the second layer of reflection where the car and the figures are. So even the reflection will have some depths that's mirroring what's going on in the surface. So it's a very simple painting. I have a lot of fun painting that. It's a very good exercise to just practicing shape, value, and wet on wet technique as well. There's not a lot of colors that I need to worry about. So I lost a little bit of reflection on the ground, so I wet the area just a little bit and press with paper towel and get rid of some of the paint. You can do that when it is still a little bit moist. You can still try to fix that and get some light back. So constantly looking at your painting, see if there's stuff that you still want to adjust. Sometimes you are still able to do that. So I come back into the foreground figure and add a little bit of value just so that it looks a little bit more dimensional and just a tiny little bit more detailed than the rest of the figures. And time to get rid of the masking fluid. And as you can see, after getting rid of those masking fluid, the light pops out. They are very little, very subtle, but it did add quite a bit more mood in the painting. I just add a little bit of the red around the light just to give it a little bit of a red glow. And here is the finished painting. I enjoy painting this one a lot, and hopefully you can give it a try as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's been a while since I painted rainy scenery and it's quite fun. It's getting a little bit dry here lately, so hopefully we're going to get some good rain soon. That's it for this week's video. You can click here to watch more videos and click here to sign up and get my Fast Track Watercolor PDF guide. I'm Eric from Cafe Watercolor. See you next time.